Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. This is Ben Amond, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create these peppermints in Blender. So there's not really a whole lot to this. We're just going to create the basic mesh, then we're going to paint a texture, and then we're going to work a lot with the shaders. So this is another really good shader exercise, kind of like the marbles from last week. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is, of course, delete the default cube, and I'm going to delete the lamp too, because right now we're going to be adding our own lamp later on, and we are using the Cycles render engine, of course. And I'm just going to start by adding a circle. Let me get in the front view here so we can see this a little better. So probably the best way to make this shape is to use a mirror modifier along the z-axis, just so that we can make sure that it's even on both sides. So I'm just going to press tab to go into edit mode after applying that. And I'm going to extrude. Ooh. Oh, I'll turn on clipping for now. Alright, yeah, and I'm going to press E to extrude and Z to lock it to the Z-axis. And the reason it was locking up is because I turned on clipping when I added this mirror modifier. And that basically prevents you from moving any vertices away from the center, if you can see that there. So turn that off by default and then turn it on later, because we do want to make sure that we don't move any of these away from the center. So I'm just going to sort of position it something like this, and I'm just right-clicking or alt-right-clicking this edge loop to select it. And it'll probably work. So from there we can extrude it again, pressing E, scale it in a little bit. Kind of move that up, maybe. Just a tiny bit like that. And we're going to tweak this a little more later. So I'm going to extrude again, scale in again, extrude again, and this time I'm going to press Alt-M for merge, and I'll choose at center. So basically that just merges all of these vertices into one single vertex in the center. And that's good. Okay. So from here we can sort of start tweaking the shape a little bit, but first I'm going to add a subsurf modifier to smooth it out. So I'm going to go up to the modifiers panel here and just find the subdivision surface modifier. I'm going to turn up the levels. I'm going to turn them up to 3 actually, because we want it to be nice and smooth, because this is going to be kind of a close-up. And we'll turn on optimal display too, to sort of speed up the display of the mesh. And I'm going to click smooth shading on the left here too. So that's actually a pretty good shape, the way it's at so far. I might select this, again, I'm just alt right-clicking to select the edge loop. Might select that and move it down a little bit. Just something like that. And there's something in the peppermints I'm actually going to add. I'm going to press Control R to add an edge loop in here, and double click, just so we have a little more to work with there. There is sort of an elevated part typically in the center of the peppermint. So I'm just going to press GZ with those selected, then maybe just select that center vertex and move that up. And that'll give you sort of an effect like that. You see that sometimes in these kinds of peppermints. And that's probably all we need to do on the mesh at this point. I might sort of mess with this a little bit more, maybe move that up a tiny bit to smooth out that transition a little more. And yeah, that's pretty good for the mesh. So at this point the next step is to just start the texture painting, and before we want to do that, of course, we want to apply the mirror modifier, because otherwise it would go all crazy and we would be painting on the top and then it would also be painting on the bottom, and that wouldn't work very well. So I'm just going to apply the mirror modifier. So now if we press tab to go into edit mode, we'll see that we can edit both sides now. And we won't apply the subsurf modifier. We're just going to keep that the way it is there, so we can adjust the levels if we have to. Okay, so this is pretty good. The next thing we want to do is we want to unwrap this so we can start the texture painting. Now the most efficient way to unwrap this is to just alt right-click this edge loop in the center right here. And I'm actually going to scale that out a tiny bit, just to give that a little bit of roundness there. And I'm going to press Control E and choose Mark Seam. So basically, if you're not that familiar with UV mapping before, then this is going to cut this mesh into 2 halves, and we're going to map it over an image like that. So it's basically going to split this mesh into 2 halves, and then put it flat on an image. And then we can sort of adjust those two halves and move them around the image to map it to the mesh. So I'm going to split my window and change this window on the right to the UV image editor. And I'm just going to add a new image. And we're going to enable the UV grid just so we can sort of see the size of everything and make sure it's all working well. We'll click OK. And now just select the peppermint over here by pressing A to select all, U to unwrap, and just choose unwrap. And you can see it's split it into two halves. And again, that's just because we have this seam in the center here that's basically the breaking point. And that's probably good. Obviously, they can't really be too much bigger. I mean, I guess we could sort of rotate them like that, kind of scale it up. I'm just pressing R to rotate, S to scale. Because you do kind of want to maximize the image space you have, because that can give a bit more clarity to the mesh. And we don't see anything yet. Even if we go into textured view, we don't see anything yet. That's because we're using the Cycles render engine. And in order for it to be visible, you have to go to the node editor after splitting your window again, add a new shader, and add a new image texture, loading that image. So it's kind of weird, but it does make sense, and it makes things a little more convenient. Because also if you have multiple image textures in this shader or something, you can just click on them and it'll display whatever image texture you have selected down here. So that size looks about right. I mean, we can't really make these circles any bigger. And the resolution's probably going to be fine then, because really all we're painting are stripes. Okay, so at this point, the next thing we want to do, we can merge those because we don't need that anymore. We can actually move this over a little bit too. We can go into texture paint mode now. And of course, the first thing we want to do is just kind of paint the entire thing white. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here, really make sure we're getting all of that. Another option to do this quickly would be to just go over to the UV image editor, because there's an option to paint directly in this window over here in the UV image editor. And then we could just paint the whole image white and then add red. But I've found that sometimes that results in kind of weird, almost texture seam-like things on the sides, wherever we have the seams for unwrapping. And whenever I've done it this way, then I typically avoid those. Okay. So now that we've got this painted white, of course, all we want to do then is add the sort of red color for the stripes, and we're gonna make it a little darker than that. Maybe add a little bit of green and blue to make it kind of a less intense red. Yeah, so that's pretty good. At this point, we want to kind of lower the radius because we're trying to set the stripes to be about the right size. Maybe we'll increase it since we zoomed in a little bit. Let's kind of just get an idea. Might want to make that even a little bigger. Alright, maybe even a tiny bit bigger than that. There we go. Okay. Let's see here. I'm actually going to come down here to the curve, too, while I'm at it. And I'm going to sort of make these a little sharper. There we go. Okay. So basically what this curve does is it controls kind of how smooth the edges of this brush are. So I just moved these little vertices closer together, these little points closer together, and so that sharpened it a lot, as you can see. Okay, so this is the really easy part. Basically, all we're going to be doing is painting from the top down, kind of like this. You might want to add a little bit of squiggliness to it, kind of a little variation like that, so that it's not perfectly uniform. And we're just going to paint that sort of down the center. Once you've done that, if you have a number pad, you can tap the 6 key twice to go to the right twice. If you don't have that key, then let's see here. I believe there's a way, if I go into user preferences, to, let's see here. It's right there, emulate numpad. And if you click that, enable that, then basically you can just use the row of numbers at the top of your keyboard as a number pad instead. So if you don't have a number pad, go ahead and simulate that, or you can just sort of move your mouse cursor around to kind of make it a little more random. It's pretty fast and easy to do it this way, though, to just be able to sort of angle your view like that. So now that we've got that, we can paint another stripe here. It's maybe a little too squiggly. Try to straighten that out a bit. And don't worry about the edges right now, is something I forgot to mention, because we're going to be using the smear brush to sort of adjust that a little more. Alright. And yeah, you basically just want to keep painting, tapping the 6 key to go to the right twice, and just sort of keep doing that all the way around. You can do some sort of fun things and kind of vary the size of the stripe. Maybe make a thinner stripe right here. Maybe slightly thicker over here. Maybe back to the normal thickness, or maybe even a little bit bigger over here. You can just sort of mess around with that a little bit. That helps make it a little more realistic. And it looks like we're almost done. Add another small stripe right there. And alright, so that's pretty good. We've got a little bit of randomness going on there, different thicknesses. Yeah, and that works pretty well. So that's pretty much all we're going to do with the stripes. The rest of this is going to be pretty much just smearing some of this around the center to make it look, to have a little bit of a spiral effect. Of course, it's not going to go all the way to the center, but to work with that a little bit. And then maybe paint some white over this to give it sort of a chipped appearance. So before we go any farther, we need to save this image. So I'm just going to click Save As Image, and I have a folder set aside for that right here. We'll just call it peppermintcolor.png. And you really want to make sure you do that, because saving the Blender file isn't enough. If you save the Blender file, it's not going to save the image, so make sure you save that. At this point, we can start, let's see here, let's switch over to the smear brush. I'm going to turn off pressure sensitivity and bring up the strength of that quite a bit. And basically, this does exactly what it says it does. If you sort of hover it over a red part right here, then you can sort of smear around that color a little bit. And that's what we're going to be doing. So we want to make it look like there's sort of a spiral effect starting to happen. So to do that, of course, we can just kind of smear these in one general direction. It's maybe a little too much. Bring it out a little more. Something more like that. Yeah. And don't worry about that weird banding effect, because we can go back in with the smooth brush later to sort of fix that. So you just kind of want to go all the way around like this. There we go. Okay, and now we've got that nice spiral effect that looks really, really good. It looks a lot more like a peppermint. So before we do the same thing on the underside, I'm just going to show you really quickly how we can use the soften brush. I'm going to turn off the pressure sensitivity and turn up the strength a bit. And if we just sort of paint over that, maybe turn up the strength even more, then it does sort of help. I guess not in all the cases in this image, but it does smooth it out a little bit so that they're not quite as sharp. These bands aren't quite as sharp. And that'll work for now. We can go back and tweak that a little more later. Go ahead and save the image. And we'll do the same thing to the underside. So again, just press Control 7 to go to the lower view. We'll select the smear brush here, and we'll just kind of do the same swirl. I don't think it really matters if it's going in the same direction, because you're not going to be looking at both sides of the peppermint simultaneously. We'll just sort of go around like that. Keep smearing it. Alright. And then grab the soften brush again and kind of go through with that. Alright. When you're using the soften brush, try to avoid getting too close to the actual edges, you know, kind of on the sides, because we want those to stay pretty sharp. And that's looking good. So there's just one other thing that I want to do after I save this to add a little more variety to. And let's see here. We can go up to the top view there. I'm going to switch back to the brush view. The first thing is I'm going to increase the strength of that. Maybe not all the way to 1. We'll make it like 0.65. But I am going to start kind of painting some little areas in here. Whoa. Something sort of like that. So you can see that kind of chipped effect, and that's what we're going for, so that it's not, you know, perfectly red on all sides. So that we've got a little bit of variation in that, and kind of some wear and tear to the color there. Then maybe we can sort of adjust the strength a little bit too, to make it a little stronger. And you really do want to do this pretty much all the way around. Maybe do some a little more obvious, like that. Maybe zoom in and make the shape a little more varied, though. Alright. So just do this all the way around. Zoom in and whatnot to kind of give a little more variation there in size. And in sharpness, too, I guess. Uh-oh. I don't want that there. There's a little bit of red there on the texture seam part. Alright, and I guess we can leave some of these, for the most part, untouched. Just kinda like that. And that works. So that really helps in giving a lot more variation to this. And then one other thing we could also do is we'll grab the eyedropper tool here and sort of take this red color from there. Is we can do the same thing kind of with the red. So we can just sort of paint, you know, like, I don't know, a little, maybe we can come down here and work with the stroke a little bit and change this to an airbrush instead, because that can give some more interesting results. Really lower the strength. Maybe not quite that low. Something more like that. There we go. And then you just want to sort of paint maybe on the center there a little bit, and then maybe some other little areas on the outside here. And this does look pretty weird at first, I know, but if we then, when we're done with that, sort of change back to the smear brush, and go back in and smear some of that around again, then it looks a lot better. So that adds even more variation, and that looks even nicer. Sort of see it there. And I'm going to save that image again. I'm going to do the same thing really quickly to the underside, just so that it sort of stays consistent. Maybe I'll lower that size a little bit. Something more like that. Maybe have something like that on this side. And that'll probably work. We can just go in with the smear brush then. Sort of mess all that up. And maybe I'll use a larger brush size for this. Okay, that looks good. We'll go ahead and save that. And now we are finally ready to move on to the shader. So I'm going to go back into object mode for this. And we're going to add a light before we do anything else. So I'm just going to move this up to the, so that it's resting on top of the x-axis. And I'm going to save this really quickly. We'll call it Peppermint Tutorial. And I'm going to press Shift-A and add a plane, and we're going to use this as our light source. Now, I'm not going to go into the exact sort of backdrop that I created for the Peppermint image. It's pretty much just a ground plane with wood texture to sort of simulate a table. And then I used this lamp over here to simulate the sun and kind of got a window silhouette to give the textured lighting. So that's not that complicated, but I don't know if we'll have time to go over that anyway. I'm going to switch to rendered view then so we can start previewing this. Make sure it's, make sure it's using my CPU and not my GPU. And we're going to add a new shader to this lamp, make it an emission shader, bring up the brightness all the way, and let's try a brightness of about 100 to start with. And that's actually perfect, pretty much. Okay. So, yeah, that's all we have to do from there. I'm going to add a ground plane, though. Maybe scale that up quite a bit. Go back into solid view there. And we'll kind of position the camera, too, so we can sort of see where we're getting with this. Alright. And that works. Okay, so now we can start working. First of all, we can merge this because we don't need that image over there anymore. So I'm just going to split my view here, and we're going to use the node editor. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is, of course, we want to connect this image texture to this diffuse texture there. So we can at least see how this looks, if not with the rest of the shader stuff, just how the image looks mapped onto the mesh. And that looks pretty good. There are some areas maybe around the red bands that doesn't look quite right, but we can go back and tweak those later. This is just sort of to give you an idea of how you might go about doing that. Alright, so the very first thing we want to do is we want to give this some subsurface scattering, because right now it looks way too almost plasticky. Not quite, because it doesn't have any reflectivity or any glossiness. But we do want to give it sort of a more translucent effect, and we can do that using the subsurface scattering node. So I'm just going to press Shift-A, and we're going to add, oops, not a toon shader, a subsurface scattering shader, and I'm going to drop this image texture into the input for this as well. And we're just going to add a mix shader and sort of combine those. And we're going to increase that factor to like 0.8 or so, because we want more subsurface scattering than we do diffuse. So if I go into rendered view right now, we can see it is taking effect. It does look at least a little bit more edible. I'm actually going to increase the scale to 1.5, just because it can get kind of, it gets a little too kind of almost milky sometimes if you're not careful. And so you do want to increase the scale a little bit in this case. It also depends on the object you're making. In this case, where the peppermint would be pretty small, so we don't want to increase it too much. But just a little bit, so that it doesn't look quite as translucent. Alright, and I'm going to move these out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and add a glossy shader now, because we want to give it that reflectivity. I'm just going to add a mix shader to combine those two. And make the roughness a little lower than that, maybe 0.1. I'm going to bring this all the way up to white. We obviously want a much lower factor in mixing this. So remember, 1 is mixing at 100%, so in this case adding 100% glossy shader, and 0 is 100% this mix shader from before. So I'm going to try like 0.04, see how that works. Alright, and that looks pretty good. I think that's about the factor I used in my final render too. This will also look a lot better when we add the bump mapping, because then you'll really be able to see sort of the textured approach show up. But that works for now. That looks pretty good. I'm actually going to, in this case, kind of rotate this. Whoa, looks like I accidentally rotated the plane instead. I'm going to rotate this, the peppermint, kind of move it up so that it's sort of facing the light source a little bit more. We'll rotate that and see how, render that and see how that looks. And that looks a little better. You can see it's sort of spreading across the bottom of the peppermint a little more there. And that's good. I'm going to increase our sampling too, from 10 to maybe 50. Alright, that looks good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add an effect that really makes it look edible and like a piece of candy. Is I'm going to add a mix shader, and we're going to mix this shader, what we have so far, with just sort of a white diffuse shader, like that. Now if we render this, it looks terrible. It looks just awful. We sort of clouded up the entire thing, and it sort of looks like we painted some sort of weird glaze over it. So to make this look, or to give this the effect that I'm trying to give it, I'm going to add Shift-A to input a Fresnel node. And I'm going to drop that into the factor there. And we're going to start with maybe an IOR of 1, because that has it pushed out completely to the sides. And then we can start increasing that, maybe 1.1, and it'll start showing up a little bit more, maybe 1.2. And if you can't see what this is doing very well, because it is kind of a subtle effect, basically it's simulating a kind of reflection or reflectivity, where it's adding this diffuse shader to kind of the outside of the mesh. So you can see it a little bit on the edges there, but I'm actually going to increase this even more to maybe 1.25, maybe even 1.3. Because this really sells the effect of it being a piece of candy or something edible. It looks really good when you do this. maybe even a little higher. I'm going to give it 1.35, and then we'll probably be done with that part. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. So already it's looking more and more edible by the second. So there's only really one other thing I want to do with this, and that's give it a bit of bump mapping. So the texture I'm going to be using for this I pulled off of CG Textures, which I'm going to provide a link for. Basically, it's an image of a shattered glass window. And I figured that will work really well because sometimes you get kind of that textured effect with the peppermints, where it kind of breaks in maybe a similar way to glass or chips a little bit. So that's the image I'm going to be using. I also brought it into Photoshop and really stepped up the contrast and converted it to black and white so that we could make the bump mapping even more strong. So I'm just going to add another image texture. Click open, and it is in the Peppermint Textures folder I created right here, this image. And we'll probably have it use the same UV coordinates, because that means it'll likely show up pretty much on the top, and that'll look good. So just to make sure we've got this all set up, I'm going to plug this into a diffuse shader and drop that into the surface. Okay, yeah. So you can see we've got this sort of breaking effect on the right here. And it will sort of catch the light and the glossiness that we have. So that's good. That's what we're trying to get. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. Plug that in again. And we're going to add a converter math node. And we'll drop the color right there. Drop the value into the displacement factor there. And I'm going to change this from add to multiply. And now we should be able to sort of adjust this factor a little bit. So the lower this factor is, then the less visible the bump mapping is. I'm actually going to make this a negative value, because in the past, whenever I've worked with this, then it's sort of made the white parts in the image the bumpy part instead of the sort of shallow part. And that's obviously way too strong. We want to turn that down maybe to like negative 0.1. That's probably still too high. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Maybe even a little lower than that. Negative 0.05 will probably work. It still looks kind of weird. I can sort of see it on the sides there, and it's not working too well. I'm going to try negative 0.035. And that'll be good. So something you can do to sort of add some variety to these peppermints is, of course, make separate image textures. But when you're making separate image textures, sort of repeating the process we did for the colored part, painting the stripes again for a new texture and all that, maybe to add a little more variation, try positioning the circles that you unwrap, so the unwrapped circles on the image, in different places than we position them, because that will result in different areas of whatever image you're using for the bump mapping to show up, and that makes that look even more realistic, so it adds that extra touch of realism. That's pretty good. I mean, it's really pretty much the end of the tutorial. There's just one other thing that I want to do to step up the realism a little bit more, and that's to give this a displacement modifier. Because right now, I'm going to add that modifier and click New to add a new texture, and I'm actually going to move that above the subsurface scattering modifier. Because we want kind of a smooth displacement, so maybe 0.1. It's probably a little too much. I'm going to try 0.05. And that'll work. Just a tiny bit of displacement like that to sort of add a little more variety so it's not perfectly smooth. And we can go ahead and step up those samples to 50 just as a starting point. And we'll just render this and see how it looks. And I'm pretty sure we're done with this tutorial for today because I can't think of anything else to do. Like I said, try painting multiple image textures for different peppermints if you're going to be creating multiple peppermints, and sort of work with the UV coordinates a little bit and kind of move that around and see what that results in. So yeah, that's pretty much it. This was a relatively short tutorial compared to some of the other ones I've done, but I hope you learned something from it. And if you have any tutorial requests, please feel free to post them on the Facebook page for this, or in the comments of this video, or wherever you think I'll see them, and I'll see if I can create a tutorial on that subject. So thanks very much for watching, and see you on the next one.